Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Today we're going to take a deep dive into a very sordid story from the Old Testament. In one way, it's just one of the many genocide stories at the hands of the ancient Israelites. Many podcasters and authors and speakers have tackled the topic before, but very few have done so using this particular passage, partly because it's just too disturbing, but partly I think also because too many of the possible interpretations are too unsettling. And here's my goal in doing this. My goal is not to tear holes in the Bible, but rather to call attention to the fact that we might be reading the Bible incorrectly. And I'm not just talking about Bible thumpers, even people on the opposite end of the spectrum. The ones who say they've given up their faith because they find the Bible to be too offensive. I think those people are treating the Bible just as incorrectly as the Bible thumpers, and in the same way, ironically. In both cases, I don't think we need to take the words literally. Divinely inspired does not have to mean divinely dictated. Instead, I come from the perspective that the Bible is a very human document. Humans actually physically wrote it, and other humans then revised those writings. They redacted, they removed certain parts and inserted new ones. And I can also accept that that whole process was divinely inspired as well. They were motivated externally, divinely, to write, to search, to ask questions and evaluate experiences and then write that down. And then we, the readers of their writings, can learn from them, learn from their mistakes and from their experiences to find a better way to live. Now, Scott and I have a little bit of biblical theological training, Scott more than me, I think. Speaking for myself, though, when it comes to the depth of my own theological training, a particular phrase comes to mind. I do know a few things, but just enough to be dangerous. That phrase is often applied to people who have spent enough time in any given subject, from theology to flying airplanes to handling a chainsaw. They've spent enough time in the subject to feel confident in their own mind, but not enough to be skilled at it, at least not in the minds of the real experts. So to keep us on track, we've invited Dr. Eric Seibert, a professor of Old Testament at Messiah College in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, and who has served as the president of the Eastern Great Lakes Biblical Society. And importantly for today's topic, he's the author of two relevant books, The Violence of Scripture, Overcoming the Old Testament's Troubling Legacy, and Disarming the Church, Why Christians Must Forsake Violence to Follow Jesus and Change the World. So Dr. Seibert, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We really appreciate it. Can we call you Eric?
That's fine. Absolutely.
Excellent. I want to let the listeners know that Eric was wisely cautious when we first contacted him about doing this topic with us, especially when I told him what passage I was hoping to explore in the topic. And so we had a fairly extensive dialogue, or trialogue, actually, off the record, to make sure that there was enough overlap between our views to make for a useful discussion. And we did find overlap, but also some potential differences. So I asked Eric if I could pitch my ideas of how to now interpret difficult passages like the one we're going to dive into today, and then he would bring his expertise and nuance to that. But that having been said, we need to put out disclaimers here. Listener discretion is advised. The views of this podcast host do not necessarily reflect the views of this highly qualified biblical expert. I think it's fair to say, right, Eric?
That's probably a good disclaimer, yes.
Okay. Now, the story we're going to focus on is found in 3 consecutive chapters from the book of Judges, and I can hear a collective gasp from the scholars, biblical scholars around the world. That's a book you tend not to touch. Eric, maybe you could get us started by telling us, why are biblical scholars cautious around the book of Judges? Why might that book be particularly difficult to translate and interpret? Where does it come from, and how did it make its way into our Bibles?
Well, thanks, Luke. I think like any Old Testament book that contains a good amount of violence, there's always a bit of trepidation as to how you talk about that today, because especially for some people, that's a stumbling block, both for folks who are outside of the faith, but also people who are also believers who are Christians. They find it difficult to know what to do with all the violence that they find in some of these Old Testament books. And Judges is notorious for its violence. There's quite a bit. Mm-hmm. Certainly, toward the end of the book, the part we'll be talking about is, some would argue that it's perhaps one of the most challenging, most difficult, most problematic text, in the Hebrew Bible. So it's a tough book to work through. And I think some people, therefore, maybe just shy away from that and look for greener pastures, as it were.
Can I ask, Eric, from a textual perspective, not to go into the detail, but compared to other biblical books, how strong is the textual evidence for Judges and so on as being part of the Bible and that kind of thing?
In terms of it being part of the canon, I'm not aware of any discussion around the book, like should this book be here or not. We just don't have a lot of evidence, honestly, for most of the books that are now in the Old Testament. There are some like, Ecclesiastes or the Song of Songs, where there's some conversation, but I'm just not aware that there was conversation like that around the book of Judges. I think
Okay.
kind of part of the bigger collection that some scholars would refer to as a Deuteronomistic history, kind of running from Joshua through Kings, is sort of part of that collection. So I'm not, again, just not aware of any particular questions about it being a canonical book per se.
Right. Okay.
I thought one of the hesitations around the book is it's based on a lot of oral history, a very long oral history.
Well, I think it would be a hesitation, I would say, for modern scholars who want to write a history of Israel. So it would be one of those books that, if you look at some of the modern histories of Israel, and again, there's not a lot of them being written, but when folks do write about that, this is a period that's kind of back there in the past that there's a lot of uncertainty as to how much historicity would be connected to the people and to the events that are described there. So they would have some questions about how useful it is in that regard.
Okay. And I thought one of the problems with books that are written based on oral history is that it's obviously sometimes potentially easy to misremember stories that were told. And one clue that critics will often point to is multiple versions of the same story having different details. And I'm thinking here of the Gospels, for example. But there's also different stories with eerily close parallels. They're clearly different stories. The names are different, but the details are so similar. You have to wonder, were they just retrieved in their memories of the authors incorrectly? And I think we see that happening in this passage we're going to talk about as well, right?
Sure. I mean, there are certainly similarities between this story and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. And people have looked at that and explored that, and there's always some kind of there's conversation, I suppose, which way the relationship goes. But there's clear connections between the two. I think it's undeniable that they the sense in which they play off one another, and you certainly want to look at them both as you think about what's going on.
So there was another parallel that really was disturbing, which was basically how a person was cut up into pieces to be used in sending messages to the nation. And there's a very similar story of Saul cutting up some oxen and cutting it into pieces and using that to send messages around the country. So is that a nation practice, or was it perhaps just a misremembered story or a misremembered myth that was passed down?
Yeah, and to be honest, I'm not sure that cutting things up and sending them around the countryside, it would have been a common practice. I mean, you're certainly right. We have the example of Saul. There's an example of a garment that's torn into a number of pieces. So there is some of those types of symbolic things that we read about in the Old Testament. But again, as a practice, I'm not quite sure how widespread that would have been.
I would hope it wasn't widespread.
Certainly not if we're talking about people. That's really, really troubling. And even animals, it's disturbing too.
So, why did I want to pick this story? This story has many of the same elements that you'll find in a lot of other genocide stories in the Old Testament, which are often used in discussions on this topic. There's the element of callous slaughter, not only of the male warriors, but also involving the women, the children, the animals. And it also has the element of God seeming to command the Israelites directly to do that slaughter. But I've chosen this passage because it has a few other ingredients baked in. First, and most importantly, it steps around the defense, which is often given for those other Old Testament passages, the genocides. Too often I hear people rationalize the slaughters by saying God had to help Israel carve out a little protective enclave in a savage land, in a savage heathen land, in order to establish a Messianic bloodline. And people who claim that are asking the listener to see the bigger picture instead of focusing on the specific sordid event. But in this case, this story in Judges, the reason for this savage series of battles is not so theologically defensible. Instead, I'm going to argue that the reason is quite simply revenge for dishonoring a particular individual. Somebody was personally insulted and he wanted the nation to get revenge on his behalf. And we'll learn that person, that individual who demanded this divinely sanctioned war was a very questionable character, let's put it that way. And finally, to make things worse, the enemy that the story claims God is sending them out against is not a heathen nation, but it's their own brothers. It's one of the 12 tribes of Israel, one of the tribes that God had made a covenant with. It was the tribe of Benjamin. So this is what makes this story stand out from the other ones, I feel.
No, I think you're right. Certainly, it illustrates a broader issue of violence, and at least in part of this story, divine violence or divinely sanctioned violence that is troubling throughout many Old Testament books.
All right, so then why don't we dive in? We haven't mentioned where this is coming from. It's Judges chapters 19 to 21. 3 chapters. They're long chapters, and we certainly are not going to take the time to read all the chapters. But what we're going to do is I've asked Scott if he'll just give the Cliff's Notes, or in Canada we call it the Coles Notes versions of the different chapters. We'll start with chapter 19.
Sure. Yeah, so in the beginning of chapter 19, we see that a woman runs away from her Levite husband, and she goes back to her father's house. The Levite goes to bring her back. When I say a woman, she's a concubine, so kind of questionable, I guess, moral character in a sense. Partway along the journey back home, a kind farmer accommodates them overnight. And that night, the men of the city demand to have sex with the Levite guest. And to our shock, I think, for modern readers, the Levite throws them his concubine, and the men have their way with her. The next morning, the Levite finds her in a heap on the front porch. He carries her home, and then he cuts her body into 12 pieces, along with the message that he wanted revenge against the men of that tribal city.
Now, that is a horrific chapter, and I don't want to dwell on the atrocities. That's not my goal. But what I do think is important is that this sets the stage for the other 2 chapters, because it's this event, this horrific event, that is the justification for the wars and slaughters that we're going to hear about in the next 2 chapters. Those were waged on behalf of one person, which is that Levite. And so to find the right context for these slaughters, we need to understand who this Levite was. And in a few words, I just want to say that this Levite comes out looking quite like a scumbag.
No, he's not I don't think you're going to find anyone who reads this story and says, we should be like the Levite. I mean, he is a thoroughly unpleasant character. The only maybe slightly redeeming factor seems to be at the very beginning, after his again, the text says concubine. Really, is a better translation would be wife of secondary status. And she leaves, and he does and spend 4 months. Why she leaves, we're not completely sure. There's a textual variation there in terms of what she may have done. So again, it's a little unclear. At any rate, after 4 months, he wants to bring her back, and so he goes to speak tenderly to her, is the way the text talks about it. So it does seem like he has good intentions initially to bring her back, but that's about as much good as you can squeeze out of the narrative about the Levite. It just kind of all goes downhill from there.
Okay. Now, Eric, you clarified what a concubine was. You said it was wife of secondary status. I thought it was a bit more than that. Scott alluded to that. What exactly was a concubine in those days?
Yeah, again, it really is not quite the way we tend to think about it. I don't think we tend to, maybe Scott, I think you said we kind of have a more sort of negative or pejorative connotation, but there was nothing necessarily negative about being a wife of secondary status, other than the fact that if from that person's perspective, they would maybe be disappointed that they weren't the primary wife, but there was nothing illicit about having a number of concubines / wives of secondary status. It's just not the primary wife in the home.
Okay, that's important to know.
Now, Eric, you had suggested that this Levite was tender towards women, and I know it reads that in the text. But there's a number of lines of evidence which really make me wonder how much this Levite, loved the woman. He's sending a mixed message, if you ask me. The one which is relatively minor to some of the things I want to talk about, but one is that after she had gone, he waited 4 months before he went after her, and it made me wonder, okay, did he really miss her? Did he love her? But the other thing that really caught my attention that suggested I question his love for this woman, it's in the middle of this situation with the angry mob of men outside the house demanding sex from the Levite. And the text says that he seized the woman and tossed her out to the men. And for me, the word seized, it sounds too harsh. If this Levite really loved the woman, it sounds violent to me. Is it as violent as it sounds, Eric?
Well, the term itself is certainly, it's a forceful word. It's the same word that's used back in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah when the angels come to say, it's morning breaks, angels come to say that they need to get out, and, Lot hesitates. And so, again, the angels seize Lot and his wife and the 2 daughters and, sort of send them out of the city. So there's forcefulness behind it. I guess I would say, even if it wasn't that particular term here to send, your wife out to this mob that is demanding to have sex with you is just bad all the way around. I mean, it's just, however we understand it, it's just bad.
Yeah.
I mean, it's horrible.
Yeah, to me, the key moral failing is in fact that the issue from a modern perspective, when we hear about him cutting, into pieces and so on, that's shocking, and it's easy for the modern reader, I think, to see that as the horrible thing. But in a sense, the really horrible thing he does is send her out to those people. The second, cutting her into pieces, it seems to me, that's just his way of enacting revenge. Like he wants to enrage the other tribes against these folks. Does that make sense?
But again, I guess I would say too, maybe even before we get to the kind of the cutting part, there is no sense of care, compassion, concern. Some commentators will note that the Levite gets up the next morning, presumably having slept, through the night, while this horrible thing is happening to her outside. There's no sense that he's concerned about her. And then when he sees her there at the threshold of the door, this thing is like, get up, we're going. You get no indication that he really cared about her well-being.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the horrors build upon horrors. It doesn't stop there. And one thing that I find so horrific, in addition to all the things that Scott and Eric, you both have been saying, is this. There's, to me, when I read it one day and I noticed these things, and I was in Div College at the time, and I talked with my professor of Old Testament at that time about this, and he agreed with me. There's hints there that the woman was still alive when he tossed her on the donkey. As Eric just said, the Levite comes out of the house, steps over her body and says, "Get up, we're going." And she didn't answer, and so he tosses her on a donkey. And there's some suggestions that she was still alive. And I'll go through three of those hints. She was able to bring herself to the doorway of the house. The text tells us she brought herself to the doorway of the house by the time dawn broke and morning appeared. So she's certainly alive, still alive at that point in time. And then first thing in the morning when the Levite gets up to leave the house, he spoke to her. Now, you don't speak to an obviously dead body to tell it to get moving unless there's some kind of a sign that the person is still alive and can hear you. And any normal person would check to see if the body on the floor was still alive before simply ordering it to get moving. But he just steps over the body, the beaten body, and says, "Get moving." And then thirdly, the text only says, "But there was no response" when he told her to get moving. It does not actually say, "But she was dead." It doesn't say, "But there was no response because she was dead." If the man was talking to a stone, you think the text would say, "But it didn't answer because it was a stone." And if he was talking to a deaf mute, the text would say there was no response because the person was a deaf mute. But here, it just sounds so not wanting to say the obvious, that this woman was still alive. There was no answer, was the best that the text could say. So we don't know for sure that she was dead when he tossed her onto the donkey and headed home. What do you think, Eric?
It's unclear. That's certainly true. We can't tell for sure. I mean, she could have been. I think the points you make are all valid points. I suppose the question, maybe the bigger question would be, if she was alive at that point, are we to envision that she's still alive by the time he gets her home and he gets the knife out to carve her up? I mean, that makes it even more horrific to think about her being alive when he's doing the carving, and we're not quite sure. That it's interesting there. I mean, that verse, it's the same word again. It's seized. I mean, he seized her. The NRSV translates it grasp, but it's actually the same words we have before. So he's seizing her again, but it's just not clear. It's extremely troubling if she's alive. It's still troubling if she's dead. Both are not.
Yeah, and not to belabor the point, but I think it's important to say about the rage that this Levite seemed to exhibit. Eric already alluded to this already. When he gets home, there's still no mention of him showing any compassion at all, no grief over her death, no days of mourning or gathering friends and relatives together to grieve with him. Instead of grief, the text describes a spur-of-the-moment rage in which he desecrates her body. Here's how the text describes the first thing he did when he got home. The text says, when he entered his house, he took a knife. That's the first thing he did. He took a knife and divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces and sent it throughout the whole territory of Israel. I don't know if that's some kind of a twisted lover's rage or some bizarre ancient Semitic ritual, but it does not sound like grief to me.
Yeah, and I guess the question again is, why is he doing this? I mean, is he doing this because he is upset that this woman has been, gang raped all night and, sexually assaulted and ultimately has died, assuming she has, and he wants some kind of vengeance for that, or is he upset because he was not granted hospitality in Gibeah when he went there, and then when he was granted hospitality by someone who actually was from the same locale that he was from, the country of Ephraim, the territory of Ephraim, then the men want to, in a sense, have sex with him, not so much because it's about sex, but that's a way of sort of showing that they're going to dominate him, again, in gross breach of hospitality. I mean, is that what he is doing this for, to kind of get back at them for what they have done to him?
Right.
Yeah, there's no, I don't get any sense in the text that he's incensed with injustice toward the concubine. That doesn't seem to have anything to do with the whole thing. It's more revenge, and the hospitality is just interesting in the narrative to me, that the author brings in the Sodom and Gomorrah story into the narrative. It reshapes it, because it seems to me that story also is about hospitality, right? It's about being inhospitable towards Lot. And so anyway, those seem to be the motivations, as opposed to, we as modern people would automatically think that what he should be incensed about, what he should be angry about, is what's been done to his concubine.
Now, we've been talking for a long time about a really horrific story, and my goal again was not to just dwell on the atrocity, but to set the stage for what happens in the next two chapters. This story that we've been talking about is so important because it makes no sense in the next two chapters why God would honor this man's his self-serving demand for revenge, petty revenge against the destruction of his property. This woman was his property, and his pride and dignity. And it makes even less sense that God would do so in a way that involved inciting all kinds of brother against brother genocide and the elimination of one of the tribes of Israel that, again, as I said, God made a covenant with. If God orchestrated the atrocities that follow in the next two chapters, which is how some people read the stories, then God is tacitly endorsing that Levite's claims for that petty revenge, and I can't see that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's definitely problematic to look at it that way. I mean, what does it make of God?
Right.
I think I've thought a few times as we've talked about this, of the opening to God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. He has that long kind of opening diatribe. He ends up by saying how the God of the Bible is the most hideous character in all of fiction. And to some degree, like I get that. When you read a story like this, certainly you can understand why somebody might come away with that feeling.
And that's my motivation again. That is the take-home message that a lot of people have taken from stories like this. They think that God is behind it all. And I'm going to argue that we don't have to read the text that way. We don't have to read the text so superficially and literally and say God stood behind all of this and he actually orchestrated these atrocities. I don't think he did. And that's what I hope to do in this episode. So let's leave chapter 19 then. We've dwelt on a horrible story for too long. Let's come to chapter 20, the next one that follows on this. The message has been sent out to the Israelites, all the 12 tribes. They're being told, hey, we have to do something about this. Scott, why don't you give us a cliff notes for chapter 20 then?
So in chapter 20, the tribal representatives all get together to look into this matter and ask God what to do. And the answer they get back in their understanding is that they're to wage war against the tribe of Benjamin because they were protecting the men of the tribal city where the atrocity actually happened. 2 times the 11 tribes were defeated by their quote Benjaminite enemies. And it's interesting that now, so what this has really kind of sparked is a civil war in many respects. And in fact, those seeking revenge are initially defeated. The 3rd time, they kill all but 600 of the Benjaminites, including women, children, and animals, and then set fire to the tribal city. So a horrible ending for the Benjaminites. And now that will, of course, lead us into the dilemma of the 3rd chapter, which just piles on another horror upon horror kind of thing.
Yeah. And as you said there, it seems that God has commanded this, but when I read the chapter, it's absolutely clear that it was not God who told them to do this. They had already decided on that course of action before they got around to, quote unquote, inquiring of the Lord. By the time you get to the middle of the chapter, you've got 400,000 Israelites lined up against 27,000 Benjaminites. And it's only at that time, at that point, that they start talking to God about how to get revenge. So, Eric, what's going on when the text says that they, quote unquote, inquired of the Lord and the Lord, quote unquote, said things to them? What's going on there?
It does look like this plan was concocted by the Israelites themselves. So there's no sense in which they're simply asking kind of a general question like, God, what should we do given this situation? So they have already determined that they're going to go up. Now, maybe just as a bit of a backstory as well in this chapter, it does talk, they do initially want to have the perpetrators of Gibeah handed over, but the Benjaminites are not willing to do that. So it is interesting to think about what would this story have looked like had that happened. Now, they wanted to have them handed over so they could kill them, which again, I would find that morally and ethically problematic. But I mean, certainly would agree there should be some measure of accountability. Okay, that doesn't happen. And then when that doesn't happen, it seems like they are now determined to go to war. And so their inquiry of God would be typical of any ancient group that's going to go to war. They want to make sure that they have divine blessing in doing that God is going to be with them and for them and on their side. And so this inquiry probably would have been something in the form of a kind of a yes or no, or in the case of the first one, they want to know which tribe should go first. So they probably have kind of a process of elimination. You kind of bring two tribes forward, and then this one's chosen, you bring another two forward, and that one's chosen. You keep kind of working them down till there's only one tribe standing, and they get the answer sort of who should go first. But they're not asking the question, should we go to war? They're asking who should go first. So they do want divine direction here, and so that's what they get. Which again, some will argue looks like divine approval. Others are not quite so sure that, in fact, maybe this is Jacqueline Lapsley talks about this passage maybe being a critique of using that kind of divine or guidance from God in this form in an example like this. I do think about the ancient mindset. They would really want to know that God is in this, because they're going to think that this is not a battle they're going to win just because they have more troops on their side than the other side. They're going to be convinced that they're only going to win if God is with them and for them. So I do think they want that sense of divine blessing and approval. Okay. It's just the responses that you get are, Judah shall go first, and the next time they ask, it's just go up against them. Both of those times they're defeated. They don't win the battle, which is causes them some stress because God's saying go and they're going and they're not winning. Right. Finally, it's only the third time that the answer comes, go up. God says, tomorrow I'll give them into your hand. And that's what happens. And then you do get a narrative statement in verse 35 that says the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel. So the text is making the claim that this is God's doing. Wherever the idea came from to do this, the fact that Israel is able to defeat Benjamin, the text, at least on the face of it, is claiming this is coming at the hand of God, which would be consistent with how victory and defeat in battle would have been viewed in the ancient world.
Okay. Do you see significance in the choice of tribes to go first and so on? And what's behind that? Like, why do they want to know who should go first? Is it because the first guys in are probably going to get the most brutalized, or what's the issue there?
Well, maybe what's interesting about that is if you go back to the very first chapter of the book of Judges, this is when they're still trying to take possession of the land of Canaan. And so they're not fighting themselves, they're actually fighting the Canaanites. And there again, the question is, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And then the Lord says, and this is Judges chapter 1, verse 2, Judah shall go up. So it's really interesting that you start out with, we're going to fight this group of people to take possession of the land that, we believe God has given to us. And now they're fighting among themselves. And so you have kind of a structure that kind of brings that full circle.
But if I may, I had asked the question, what is behind the meaning of the words when they say they go to inquire of the Lord, and then the Lord said this and that? When we read that today through 21st century eyes, evangelical eyes, we have this vision of the people somehow talking to God and God talking to the Israelites. And yet, the way you described it, Eric, it sounded a lot more mechanical. In our pre-talk, the three of us were talking, and I said it's almost as if they're consulting a magic 8-ball. They just sort of ask the question and they shake the ball and see what answer comes up, and the answer comes up very mechanically. So how do we then interpret those words that they asked of God, they inquired of the Lord, and God said these things?
So there would be some process of divination. It's not specified here exactly how they do that, like what the mechanics is. But I think you're right. It's not as though I don't think we should envision a group of Israelites in a room praying, and all of a sudden an audible voice comes and says, "This is what you're supposed to do." That's how we tend to sometimes, I think, read the text. But in these cases, they're asking for divine guidance. So I would envision this sort of like the second time they ask, should we go up? And when you kind of get the thumbs up, yes, go. It's sort of like you take a coin and you flip the coins. Heads, God says go. Tails, God says don't go. And you do something like that. The Bible talks about casting lots. It's sort of that idea where you're doing something that you truly believe is not just random chance, but that God is going to guide that process to give a divine answer. So I would envision something physical like that happening, and then whatever the result being, in this case, it's a yes, then they say, this is what God has said to us, even though there was no audible voice speaking that at the moment.
Now, I'm going somewhere with all of this. So what I heard you say, Eric, was that when they asked these questions of the Lord and they get an answer, however they got that answer, I use the image of a magic 8 ball, but maybe they're using, I don't know, sticks, bones, something like that, something along those lines. But the point is that they had the assumption based on theological grounds that however the sticks fell, the answer was from God. They just assumed that the answer was coming from God. And in the end, when they won the battle the third time, they just assumed that God gave the enemies into their hands. And that's how the text reads. I question whether it was God leading them into this, because again, as I said, it's all based on that chapter 19. God is sending these guys to war against their brothers because this Levite was insulted. And I just questioned the whole thing. And then on top of that, the fact that God told them to go ahead and they were defeated. And then he said, go ahead, do it again. And they were defeated. And the third time around, maybe they learned a few tricks in how to wage battle against this city army. Then they won. I just see this too much as being people doing things, deciding things, and attributing it to God. And we'll find out in the next chapter, blaming it on God.
Right. I mean, it certainly is. And again, this is, as I was preparing for this, looking at a couple different scholars, and one just making the point, this is certainly a disproportionate kind of response. You kind of think back to the old, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. I mean, this is crazy amount of violence for the violence that was, the inhospitality that was done to him. And so that also seems a bit out of character from what we might expect to be some kind of response.
Right.
Again, I think the bigger issue here is the question, whenever we see the text attributing acts of violence like this to God, what do we do with those? I mean, is that in fact, as readers of Scripture today, do we need to say, oh, this is what God actually did? Or can we say, no, this is what Israelites understood God did, and their worldview is different from ours, and we can view this differently? How do we deal with these passages where God appears to be, in many cases, very vengeful, very violent, doing a lot of smiting and slaying? Is that actually what God did, or is that just people in the ancient world viewing gods in those kinds of ways?
Right. And we will address that near the end of the episode. But I just want to finish off one last point about this chapter, and then we'll get into chapter 21 and address that very question. There is this one detail that I think the listener needs to bear in mind before we do move to the next chapter. When the call was put out to all the warriors all through Israel to rally at this one place and get ready for battle, one tribal city decided, for whatever reason, we're not told why, but they decided they weren't going to take part in this carnage and civil war. And that tribe was it was a tribal city of Jabesh-Gilead. They were the first conscientious objectors, the OG peaceful protesters. And again, that will be important in the next chapter.
Can I just jump in there for a minute? I think the text doesn't make a claim as to why they didn't come. I think there's a good reason why they wouldn't have, and that's because they would have been loyal to Saul. Saul, back in 1 Samuel, when the Ammonites are oppressing, I think it's Gad and the Reubenites, this King Nahash is gouging out the right eye of all these folks. And so some people escape and they go into Jabesh-Gilead. And Saul then is the one who actually delivers them from this fate of having their right eye gouged out. So Saul was a Benjaminite. They would have been loyal to Saul, and so they're not going to go fight against the Benjaminites. That's the group that they would have a loyalty to. So I do think there's reasons as to why they didn't participate.
Excellent, and that, folks, is why we bring on the Old Testament scholars to address these questions. I didn't know that. Clearly, Eric, you did. And the main point is not why they didn't take part. It is just important. You'll see, the listeners will see in the next chapter, 21, that It was these people who did not take part in the Civil War. They're going to be named again, and it's atrocious when we hear that. So, Scott, why don't you give us the Cliff Notes on chapter 21 then?
Sure. So once the smoke had cleared, the 11 tribes of Israel felt badly. I guess that's a kind of almost euphemistic way of putting it, that God had decimated the tribe of Benjamin. So now they had created, in fact, another problem, and in a lot of ways, I think a much bigger problem. So to fix that, they decide they're going to lay siege to another unsuspecting tribal city who wasn't part of the genocidal war in the first place, and killing all the men, women, and children, but keeping 400 virgin daughters from that city as captive sex slaves for the 600 surviving Benjaminites, so they can repopulate. I mean, this to me is almost the most horrible part of this whole narrative. I mean, there's just compounding horror upon a horror here. To fix one thing, they're doing something worse. And anyway, because they were 200 virgins short, they orchestrate kidnapping of more virgins from another unsuspecting tribal city to fill the quota. So that's how it ends.
And the main thing that, to me, this is the most galling part of the whole story, all 3 chapters, after all this carnage and atrocity, these guys are blaming God. You read the text, and they're blaming God for what had happened. Although the text says that they gathered to find out why he did it, they don't even wait for an answer. They decide among themselves that they have a solution. They need to come up with the substitute wives, the 600 that Scott just mentioned. And here's where that city comes up that I just mentioned a moment ago. The way to find those substitute wives was to launch an attack against Jabesh Gilead, the ones who did not take part in the carnage in the first place. They were the conscientious objectors. And they are the ones who are then put to the sword. All the men, women, and children and animals are killed except for those virgin daughters. That's the solution, to kill these people who decided that they were not going to take part in the carnage. It's all so bizarre to my 21st century ears.
Yeah, no, it's really, really troubling. I mean, both the women from Jabesh Gilead and then the women from Shiloh who are abducted and put into forced marriages. It's horrible.
Yeah.
And it's ironic, again, as commentators will point out, because think about what precipitated this. You have one woman who is, sexually violated and abused, and that precipitates all this other carnage. But now you're kind of correcting that, so to speak, by doing the very same thing that happened that kind of started the whole thing in the first place. So it's just a mess all the way around.
Right, yeah, I heard that as well. Avenging one rape by committing 600 more rapes, but then also lamenting one genocide and fixing that by committing another genocide. It is so ironic and backwards.
Well, Luke, you mentioned at the outset that one way to possibly look at a text like this is not to look at it as, well, this is supposed to be normative or this is supposed to be instructional for how we should do things, but kind of look at it and say, this is a awful mess, and what is instructional about it is the fact that violence breeds violence. Revenge breeds further violence and further atrocity. And when you look at the story as a whole, it is a real horrible delineation of that cycle that we still see going on in the world today, right?
I would add to what you said, Scott. You said that the moral of the story is that violence breeds violence. It is certainly that, but I think there's more that the story is trying to tell us. These guys were doing what they thought was right in their own eyes, and that's how the whole passage, all 3 chapters, they all fit together, but it all ends with that phrase.
Yes.
There was no king in Israel at that time, and everyone did as they saw fit. And I think that's the moral of the story, that people, when they're left on their own, they just go from bad to worse to worst.
Right.
And they blame it on God. They somehow attribute it to God. Let's leave the atrocity behind. I want to come to the most important part of this episode, which is to now try to redeem the story. The usual outcome when people read a story like this is they read it, it's horrific, they keep on reading, it's more horrific, and it gets more horrific, and it just gets so bad. And sometimes in the end they say, this is not a God that I can worship. I can't hold this faith anymore. And I think there's something deeper in the story than God commanding that atrocity on behalf of that, really despicable Levite, I have to say. So how do we redeem this story? How do we get something meaningful and valuable out of this story rather than the horrors and atrocities and this is not a God I could worship?
Well, I mean, I think there's several things you could do that. I'll just maybe name one, and then we can kind of go back and forth a little bit if you want. I do think this is a story that highlights what for us, currently is is an epidemic, and that is violence against women. I mean, we have this problem all around us. It's a problem that we don't talk a whole lot about in the church, or at least most churches don't. And so I think a text like this that is showing us all sorts of violence against women, not just the Levite's wife, but also all these other virgins that are mentioned, that would be an entry point into that kind of conversation. How as a society do we participate in that? How do we take steps to guard against that? What senses are we complicit in that? What resources are there for people who have been victims of sexual violence, sexual abuse? How can we come alongside them? I mean, all of those kinds of conversations that are not easy conversations to have, I think would be the kind of thing that could grow out of a text like this. So in a sense, we hold this up as, I think maybe as Tom Stark says, sort of as a negative example, like as a mirror of what we don't want. And you can use that as an entry point into really important discussions.
Yeah, well, I was going to make a point of saying that one thing that comes very clearly to a modern reader, and may not have in the ancient world, but is that, women are things. Like, women are just furniture in this, tossed around in the story. There's no narrator intervention, those subtext speaking to about the women's side of it. They're just things. They're just props of violence in the story, and that does reflect something horrible about the ancient world and about even Israel at that time. The other thing I was going to say is that it seems to me that this whole thing, reading a story like this, brings up the larger question of how do we read Scripture. Right? Because if we read Scripture in a certain way, you could use it to justify some of this. But if we read it, what I would argue, and I know you guys would argue would be rightly, would be that just because something is in Scripture and we're witnessing the way people in the ancient world saw God and so on, doesn't make it normative. It doesn't mean that that's the way God wants it to be. It's simply reflecting what was at that time. So in other words, to me, especially in the opening chapters, the Pentateuch and so on in the Old Testament, God is absolutely a tribal God from the view of the Israelites. He's a tribal God, not much different than other tribal gods, except that they believed he was the most powerful tribal God, right? But it seems to me that through Israel's history, there's kind of a discussion going on. They're beginning to see God as more, less and less of a tribal God. And by the time Jesus comes along, he breaks down those barriers completely and reveals a very different understanding. So if we look at it that way, in that kind of context, does that help deal with a story like this, do you think?
So hearing the two of you then answer that, it sounds like the angle you took is very much from the human angle. This is not the way humans should be doing things. This is not the way men should be treating women. The human angle. And yet the problem is a lot of readers, when they read this story, they come in at it from the God angle. They say, how could God do this? How could God command these atrocities, these slaughters? And God gets blamed. And I think that's the point of the story. It's not God. It is the humans who are at fault here. I do not see God leading these people into this battle or the several battles. I don't see him talking to these people. I can see men, ancient Semitic men, making their own decisions that lead from bad to worst, and they're blaming it on their token understanding of their national deity. And yet I still can see God in the background letting those guys, those despicable people, tell the story as they see it. And not because it's the truth, but because it can reveal truth to a reader who really wants to look for it. There's a method of teaching called the Socratic method of teaching, which is basically by posing questions and having the listeners think about the questions, and those listeners will come to the truth by resolving the questions in their mind. And so I can see God letting the authors of this text tell the story as they saw it. And in the background, God is talking to the readers, not to those people, but to the readers, you and me. And he's saying, look at this story. I want you to reflect carefully on this story. Did this turn out well? Is this really the best way that this thing could have been handled? And look more closely. Does it really sound like me talking to these guys? Or instead, does it look more like people, the Levite and the nation of Israel, doing what seemed right in their own eyes and using me as their alibi, and things going from bad to worst? I think that's the take-home message. The message in this story is not anything to do with Israel's origins, their history, but rather God saying, this is what's in the human heart. This is who you people, not just Jews, But people, you guys in what 21st century Western countries, this is at your core. And that's the nugget of truth that we can find if we dig deep enough.
I mean, clearly, the Book of Judges is showing us Israel at its lowest. I mean, the book progressively gets worse as you kind of make your way through. There's as people talk about the judges cycle, you have these major judges, and even that the cycle itself begins to deteriorate. Things get worse and worse and worse. For most of the book, you're not exactly sure what's going on. You get general statements about people worshiping other gods, but it doesn't go a whole lot further than that. And I've heard these last couple stories. There's two different accounts of Levites. The one we're looking at now, and there's one right before it in a couple chapters. It's sort of like it's like someone's turning down the microscope. You're kind of getting a zoom lens, like to get to see what's going on, and it's really, really bad. And so again, I think the text is supposed to be showing us this is what happens when people just do whatever the heck they want to do.
Right.
So I do think that's the overall point of the book and where it's sort of heading. You still have to kind of, again, we will come to this, I guess, in chapter 20, there's these places where it does attribute certain things to God. So I guess I would want to say, how much of this does the text attribute to God? Well, there's nothing in chapter 19 that's attributed to God. There's really not much in chapter 21 that's attributed to God. It's mostly there in chapter 20. So if the whole thing about getting these wives from Jabesh Gilead and from Shiloh, the text never claims that was God's design, God's desire, God's idea. It just sort of happens. So again, I do think that's not so much a problem for how we view God. It's just a mess that people are making when they're trying to do their own thing apart from God. So I think it's helpful to maybe keep those two things separate. How much is the text claiming God's doing, and how much is just people, as you said, and that's a text that's doing what's right in their own eyes.
But as I understand it, Eric, you're saying that 19 and 21 don't have God behind it, but in 20 there's a hint that God is behind it because the text says as much. And as I understand it, Old Testament texts in general, and some in particular, certainly these kinds of texts that we're talking about now, they went through a lot of revision, and I understand quite a bit of that happened in the Babylonian captivity when Israel was saying, what happened to us? We were supposed to be God's people. We were supposed to be the rulers of the world, from their point of view. And here we are in Babylon as captives. What happened? And they're trying to understand who they are and where they came from. So a lot of the texts were revised. And there's lots of evidence of the text not just being tweaked, but even whole passages moved, whole passages taken out, because you can see some old versions and some newer versions, and even some things thrown in, sometimes from pagan sources. So where I'm leading to on this, Eric, is they were revised. The texts were revised, and sometimes in order to make sense of what happened to the people. And I would suggest that this story here was revised because I can't see God orchestrating any kind of battle like that on behalf of that Levite man who was so despicable. I think rather where the text says God gave the Benjaminites into their hands, I think that's the authors writing that in. That's my viewpoint.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar enough with the sort of the compositional history of Judges to know, some of these parts we have textual evidence for this or that piece being revised. I mean, you're certainly right. There are various manuscripts, and there are places I know we can sort of see changes that have been made. I'm not familiar enough with these three chapters to know how much of that has happened here. I think I tend to read chapter 20 a bit more straightforwardly, that this is simply a way that they are making sense of this experience of warfare, that this does have divine sanction, it does have divine blessing. Sure, it's not ideal, sure, it's messy, sure, it had some really bad consequences, but I still think they would have said, yeah, but this is coming from God. This is something that God has sanctioned for us to do. This battle against the Benjaminites was not simply something that we just did all on our own. I guess I would not make the same claim about chapter 21 when they're going out to get these wives from Jabesh Gilead and Shiloh. I don't see the text saying this is what God wanted us to do, and we're gonna say this had divine blessing. I don't see it there. So I guess I still see the problem of divine violence concentrated most heavily in chapter 20.
So with regard to the whole issue overall of divine violence, I'm not sure that these three chapters provide a lot to that discussion in a sense. To me, the more troubling sections of scripture are things like the Joshua campaigns, where it's clear that God is telling them to go into the land and commit genocide, essentially. What do we do with that? Like this, I think you can, discussion we've had, I think, can shed a lot of light on these stories. This is manageable from my perspective. Because of some of the ambiguity and so on. However, there are other sections where you can't write it off that simply. And that bleeds into the modern world. I mean, we live in a world now where, for example, Christian Zionism is very much a significant movement. And a lot of the U.S. support for Israel financially and so on is rooted in that Christian Zionist movement, where there's a lot of money funneled because there are many Christians who believe that whatever Israel does, whether it's secular or not, is divine, and that they have the right to commit violent acts, and they base it on things, these kinds of things in the Old Testament. So this is very, very relevant discussion. For me anyway, those things are more. It'd be interesting to have if we could have another episode on those passages. Eric, what do you think of that?
I think you're right. This passage is not a passage that typically would come up when I'm talking about divine violence, just because there are so many others that are, I think, just so much more blatantly troubling.
Right.
Not that, I'm still troubled by what I read in chapter 20. It still bothers me when I read, the Lord defeated Benjamin, and we're talking about 25,000 people, is what the text claims. That these numbers are clearly, exaggerated, but still, that God is the one who is orchestrating victory in battle, and all that implies. Because you have to think about it in terms of, okay, now we're talking about widows, we're talking about orphans. The way this text goes, they're all killed anyway. So the whole thing is it's a messy text, but it's not the one that's front and center. It's like either the flood narrative, where you're having all the population except for 8 who are wiped out, is Sodom and Gomorrah, where it's like indiscriminate killing that seem to be more well-known stories. This one is so troubling at other levels. It's hard to get past chapter 19. I mean, again, this chopping up this woman is it's horrific. And so people get, I think, more stuck on that, and they're maybe more worried about what do I do with this yucky, horrible story than they are with things in chapter 20 that sound like what they've read elsewhere in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
But as I said at the beginning, I wanted to pick this because the implications are there that God was behind this, and yet we're all agreeing this couldn't have been God doing. God wasn't going to direct the whole nation of Israel to get rid of the whole tribe of Benjamin just because this Levite was insulted. And yet the text seems to suggest that God did this. He gave Benjamin into their hands. Instead, I argue that it's not, as the text says, that God did this, but rather those people who wrote the text, that's how they interpreted it. That was their understanding, their interpretation, their justification of what happened. And I then extend that general idea to some of these other stories that you referred to, the Canaanite slaughters that led by Joshua. Scott, you put that on the table. Again, I would suggest that these were stories that were remembered and revised in Babylon, when these people are trying to understand, who are we? We're now slaves in Babylon, but we were supposed to be the people of the God of Israel, of the world, actually. And they're trying to justify, and so this is part of their story, their origin story, that they understand. But the archaeological evidence for those Canaanite invasions of Jewish people into those lands and overturning a Canaanite culture, the evidence is not there for that. And so those stories as they're written are not telling history. They're telling a story that the people have. When I say crafted, that could be taken the wrong way, that it's malicious. I don't mean that. But these people have crafted a story to justify their history, their story, and their struggle. And these stories are their understanding of what happened, and that they're remembering from the far distant past and attributing a lot of things to God, like the Canaanite slaughters led by Joshua, or in this case, the slaughter of a whole tribe of Israel because some Levite was insulted. And I don't see it that way, but I can still see the Bible as being divinely inspired. I've already made that point.
Mm-hmm.
There's value in the story, looking at the human heart. Rather than getting at the origin of Israel, the story is getting at the human condition, the human heart.
Well, I think the point that some people are going to raise questions, though, is if we say Judges 20 or some of the other stories, that what we read here about God and God doing these things really wasn't God, but just was Israel's remembrance or reflections on God, then on what basis do we make that determination? Because I think for many people, when you use language like the Bible is divinely inspired, they believe that means that God exerted a significant amount of control in terms of what got into the text. And so the question then, that the follow-up question is, why would God allow God's self to be misrepresented in the Bible, this text that we say is authoritative for how we think about who God is and what God is like? So I think that's the pressure point some people are gonna push back on. I think some would be relieved by what you say. Oh, it's a relief to think that this is just Israel's thoughts about God and didn't really reflect what God was like. But yikes, if I do that, then how do I know like what's true about God from the Bible and what's just someone thinking about God?
But to answer your question, why would God do that? Why would he let them tell the story that way? I've already suggested God did that because he's forcing people to think, does this sound right? Does this sound like it's the right way to act? Does this sound like the God of love, for example? And so he's allowing the story to be told in order to raise questions in the minds of a reader who's willing to really chew hard on it and try to find out, okay, this doesn't sound right. The way the story is being given to me does not sound right. And I think as you immerse yourself in it, as you pull on the threads, things fall apart. And I think there's a deeper truth in that story than just simply, yeah, God led these people to kill all those other people because the Levite was insulted.
You know, it's interesting when you talk about origin stories, and that certainly seems to be a common thing in the ancient world, that any society developed its own origin story. In fact, in the modern world, America has its own origin story, right? It has a basically canonical story of how America came to be, based on the idea of freedom and liberty and all those great things. And if you dig into it, you discover that, well, there's truth to it, but it's a story too. I remember doing a tour of Boston many years ago, and the tour guide, everything we talked about, she said, well, to be honest, what you heard, it really didn't quite happen that way, like the Boston Massacre and things like this. And it was kind of funny in a way, because she was almost debunking but it was interesting. But what's interesting about Israel's the conversation, I might call it, that goes on throughout the Old Testament, is it's so unflattering to Israel. Like it's almost an anti-origin story. Like it doesn't make them look particularly good in many respects, right? So if you were writing a national narrative to argue that you should be the people, to rule the world, I'm not sure you'd write it in the way that the Old Testament is written.
Okay, so I thought of a better example of how to make the point I did a moment ago. It's a teaching of Jesus that a lot of people struggle with. I certainly struggled with it for years. And the point that I'm going to make then is, you don't read the text superficially, you look for what it's really trying to say rather than what it seems to be saying. So when Jesus tells people, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. And all the men in the audience start getting nervous and shifting their seats because they have visions of themselves and all their friends walking around with no hands and no eyes. But maybe that's not what Jesus is saying. He's not saying cut off your hands and pluck out your eyes. He's saying if those are the root of the problem, then you need to make some drastic changes on those external parts of your body. But maybe those aren't the root of the problem. And this is where you would be led to if you really tried to chew into this passage. Are those really the problem? Is it really my hand? Is it really my eye? No. Maybe the root of the problem is in your mind, your thought processes and your values. And maybe that's where the drastic surgery needs to take place. And that's the truth that you won't find if you just read it superficially. Well, I guess God or Jesus wants me to cut off my hand now. No, he's not saying that. He's saying, if it's your hand, cut it off. But maybe it's not your hand. And if you just read the story superficially, you'll be left with a lot of bad theology and no hands to hold it in.
Well, sure. Maybe it'd be horrifying if someone took those words of Jesus, literalistically, and did self-mutilation.
Well, there's Augustine, right? Augustine castrated himself because
Origin, not Augustine.
Origin. Sorry, I got the wrong name.
Yeah,
the same idea.
That's okay. I think I think, frankly, I've never had a big issue with that story, because I just think it's so obviously hyperbolic. And basically what he's saying is, remove the root of the problem. Right. If something is causing you to fail, to sin, remove that thing,
Yeah.
And he's using hyperbolic language to make it, it's a rhetorical device, right? We're sitting here talking about it, right? So that demonstrates the power of hyperbola, right? Like it's just memorable. People would never forget him saying that. Cut off your hand, and you're right, Luke. And then it causes a thought process to occur, which is exactly what he wants to do. So,
and I think that's what's happening in Judges 19, 20, and 21.
Okay.
And I guess if I can maybe just push back a little bit, I think though again I can hear someone saying, okay, but that's like a saying of Jesus, and obviously that was hyperbole and rhetoric to kind of get at a point. Clearly, Jesus doesn't want to do that, but we're talking about judges, and this is this is Israel's story. This is history, and it has a sort of sense of divine authority because this is God's sort of version of the story and what happened, and God is inspiring people to write these things in certain kinds of ways. I think they would say it's a different genre, so it doesn't quite, the analogy doesn't maybe quite work as neatly because of that.
Well, I'll just say very quickly, yes, it is a different genre. I get that. And it is divinely inspired, but I don't see divinely inspired meaning it's divinely dictated. I think God could inspire people to tell a story that's false, but it's going to raise questions in the minds of listeners. And those questions will lead to a bigger truth than just what the superficial reading of the story would lead them to.
Yeah, Tolkien talked. If I'm getting this right, Tolkien talked about kind of telling a lie to tell the truth. In other words, or in his case, maybe a fantasy. Nobody believes that the events of Lord of the Rings actually occurred, and yet you could say, in a lot of ways, that the Lord of the Rings is a really true story, right? In the sense of what it's the deeper meaning of it, right? Which is, right. I think, why it is so powerful. And I think that's true of many narratives, right? The battle of good and evil and things like that. So it could be that biblically we do have cases where it's not true in the sense of how modern post-Enlightenment people think of truth, as CNN reporting, although maybe not CNN, but anyway, you know what I'm saying. But the truth is deeper than that. It's like, I guess you've been saying, Luke, it's not on the surface. We read these stories and then we have to think about them.
Right.
And I guess this harkens back maybe to the Lutheran idea Luther's idea of the Christological interpretive method, where we have to look at them through Christ. On the Emmaus Road, he says, this story is about me. So if that's true, then we have to filter the story of Judges through what we know of Christ and what he has revealed to us about God. And when we filter it that way, it's obvious that many of these things are not right. And so anyway, Eric, what do you think of that?
I like that. I think it's helpful because it gives you kind of it's a principled approach to determining then what you can or can't know about God from Scripture.
Right.
Because again, we don't want to. Nobody wants to just pick and choose and sort of make a God in our own image, because that doesn't really help a whole lot. Like I want to think about God as closely to what God's actually like. Right. And so, I would start with the premise that, we see God most clearly through the person of Jesus. Right. So that Jesus becomes our standard by which we can evaluate some of these literary portrayals. So we're not simply picking and choosing, but we've got reasons for why we say, this clearly reflects a culturally conditioned understanding of God, but this is not reveal what God is actually like, because we know better, because we see this differently through Jesus. Right. So I think that's a really useful principle to work with.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
I wanted to give Eric the last word. Have you just had the last word, or did you want to say something else yet?
Maybe, I guess, just a word of encouragement to listeners. Again, I know this is a really difficult passage. I do think, if we're careful to read it responsibly, there are things that we can take away from it that can still be, useful and constructive. It could even be a passage that we would use for, confession, just to think about the ways that we have failed in some of these areas in our relationship toward others. So I think that could be another way to think about this, how we've treated maybe the women in our own lives, and also just to sort of, some people have pointed out that the way a society treats women is often a barometer, sort of a broader society. So again, commentators will often connect this story to the rape of Dinah in Genesis 34, to the rape of Tamar in 2 Samuel 13. And again, in both of those stories, when there's violence perpetrated against a woman, it doesn't just end there. There's also these other consequences that flow out of that, other acts of violence as well. So I do think the story can be a really useful point to think about that, and hopefully to help us, to do better going forward. So just maybe, again, a word of encouragement. These difficult texts, they're hard to read sometimes, hard to work with, hard to look at, but I do think there are still ways they can be beneficial to us as Christians. There's still ways to use these texts in constructive ways if we look at them carefully and read them responsibly.
Right. And a reminder to the listener, Eric, you've written those 2 books. Are there more in the pipeline?
The next book that I have coming out, hopefully it'll come out next year. I'll see if I can get my manuscript off to the publisher by the end of the year, soon thereafter. It's title's not set yet for sure, but something like Using Violent Verses in Church. So it's just a really practical guide for what do you do with these difficult passages for preaching, for teaching Sunday school, like in liturgy. Again, I want to think about that. This would be a tough one to do. That,
yes.
But again, and you have to be careful. You have to be age appropriate. Like, this is not a story you're going to be teaching, the 5 and 6 year olds. It's not that kind of story. Right. But there are places where the church does need to talk about these to give people some guidance of what do you do with some of these texts. So that's my next book. It's a Westminster John Knox publication. So hopefully sometime next year that will be out next year.
Yeah, that sounds excellent.
And we'll have links to how people can contact you in the show notes. Eric, do you have any kind of a blog or podcast site or a web page of some kind?
Probably the best thing I have right now is a website that is being constructed. So if people want to at some point look at, it's ericseibertphd.com. There will be books there and things, my books I've written and things there. So, but it's in process. So I'm working on creating a digital presence. I'm a little slow behind the curve here, but we're
good. Well, it's good to see that. Well, Eric, thanks again for giving us your expertise. I'm a work in progress, and you've helped maybe shave a few more corners off of my bristly exterior. So,
well, it's been a pleasure, Luke and Scott, to chat with you. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us. It's been, I think, a very good discussion. Sometimes discussions don't end with all answers, but
that's right.
It helps us in the journey.
All right. Thanks again, Eric. Have a good day.
Thank you. Blessing.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.